Now, I just want to introduce someone who is in turn going to introduce your keynote speaker this morning, and that is Marie Schroff, the Privacy Commissioner. I tried to find out some information about Marie, but being the Privacy Commissioner, that's not easily done. However, as fortune would have it, I've made an ACC claim recently, and an email arrived just last week with everything I needed to know. So that was fantastic. But the highlights are, of course, that she was appointed the Privacy Commissioner in 2003, and so it's a significant tenure in that role. And prior to that, she was, of course, Secretary of the Cabinet and Clerk of the Executive Council for 16 years. And she is going to introduce our keynote speaker, Marie Schroff.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I think I have heard that crack before, but I'll let it pass. About, she's so private I can't find anything about her. Actually, if you Google on my name, I think you do get really rather a large number of hits. But anyway, so we're here today, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome Pamela Jones-Harbour from the United States, a former Federal Trade Commissioner. But just before I launch into my intro, I just want to remind you, for those of you who read the Herald either online or in the paper version, if you're wondering why we're talking about privacy as one of our focuses, well, that shows you. The two front page stories in the Herald actually stem from privacy issues. One of them is about employee browsing in a major government department, and the other one is about Kim.com, and of course that is an internet and a privacy story. So can't explain that in detail, but I'm sure everybody in the audience will quickly see the connection between control of personal information and the internet. So Pamela Jones-Harbour was a Federal Trade Commissioner from 2003 to late 2009, and she's now a partner in that very well-known US law firm Fulbright & Jaworski, and she heads the Privacy, Competition and Data Protection Practice Group, which is a really interesting connection. In the US, I think it's true to say privacy is seen as a consumer protection and competition issue as much as it is a human rights issue. So I'm sure Pamela will make those connections for us. And in 2010, the Electronic Privacy Information Centre, which is a human rights pressure group, awarded her the Champion of Freedom Award for her defence of consumer privacy as an FTC Commissioner. And on a personal note, I can attest that I've had quite a bit to do with Pamela over the years in the international privacy arena, which is huge, in case you were wondering. And she has a reputation for calming the hotheads and for finding solutions. So I think that's going to be interesting to hear from her. So just before I hand over to Pamela, I've been asked to give it a little bit of context, which I'm going to do. So of course we all know there's been an explosive growth in the digital economy. The Boston Consulting Group says that by 2016 the internet will be the world's 5th largest economy, worth $4.2 trillion of global output. Personal information is at the core of the growth in the digital economy, behavioural advertising, social media, collection of customer information, and many customers are very ambivalent about this brave new world. In New Zealand alone, 81% of respondents in our survey didn't trust the security of their personal information on the internet. So there's a huge challenge for privacy law and privacy regulators to catch up. I'm sure Pamela's going to tell you whether privacy laws are up to the job in the US, and this was something that she dealt with as a Federal Trade Commissioner. And please remember that regulating internet companies in the US can in effect make law protecting us in the rest of the world. So that's one of the reasons why her address will be fascinating. I've also been asked to remind you that law reform in New Zealand is catching up with better protection for consumers' information, and I've been asked to just remind you of some of the major proposals that the Law Commission has made, so that hopefully mentally you can be making the connection with the themes that Pamela is going to bring out. The Law Commission has proposed to give me a compliance notice power. So I would be able to enforce protection of consumers' interests where persuasion fails. Audit powers. I may be given the power to go in and investigate when gaps appear in agencies' care of personal information, and perhaps you could say that the immigration story was an example of that. Mandatory breach notification. There's a proposal that when customers are put at risk because of loss or theft of their personal information, organisations would have to tell consumers. I might be able to, given the power to audit the takedown of offensive and damaging online disclosures, and also the law may be changed to make agencies, government departments, companies expressly responsible for personal information wherever it is, online, in the cloud, or in a filing cabinet. So there are obviously parallels with what the FTC has been doing and what's happening in America. The bottom line is that consumers will not take full part in the online economy unless they trust that the companies they deal with will protect their personal information. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Pamela to shed more light on these vital issues, and if there's time at the end, she has graciously agreed to take one or two questions. Pamela.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Schroff, for that kind introduction. Good morning. As you heard, my name is Pamela Jones-Harbour. I am a partner at the law firm of Fulbright and Jaworski, and prior to joining Fulbright, I served as a U.S. Federal Trade Commissioner for a number of years. Let's see, I'm clicking this, and it is not moving. Let me try it again. All right. I was told that it's really easy. The arrow is going this way. I'm clicking, and it's not moving. Oh, there it is. It's slow. All right, it's caught up with me. But I will say this is my first visit to New Zealand, and I am delighted and honored to be down under and actually to talk about my privacy issues on day one of the conference. But usually before I give a speech, I always like to introduce some humor, and so I went on the internet to look for an appropriate joke, and my query references that came back were in response to sheep. So therefore, I think I'm going to forgo the joke and make an observation. I understand that the sun shines in New Zealand before anywhere else in the world, and that the fanfare surrounding the Lord of the Ring trilogy is finally waning, but I understand that The Hobbit is coming. But I want to thank Internet NZ and Commissioner Schroff for this delightful opportunity to speak with you about data privacy and security and what until recently has been characterized as the FTC trifecta. I went backwards. Okay. You know what? Is there someone back there that can just turn the slides for me? Okay, here we go. Look at this. Now it is, all right. The FTC trifecta, I'm going to go to that. There we go. That is to say the U.S. Federal Trade Commission complaints against Twitter, Google, and Facebook. And while I was preparing my remarks for this conference, the FTC issued a complaint against MySpace, so I will discuss that also. And I will talk about how these recent cases are important milestones in the United States' emerging common law of privacy enforcement and the important role that these cases will play in protecting consumers worldwide. Now, the United States and New Zealand share common elements of history and culture and a commitment to democratic principles. As for privacy protection, New Zealand's Privacy Act of 1993 has been called the most comprehensive national privacy law outside of Europe, even as the Law Commission proposals are currently with the government for consideration, and the content of a government bill is expected to be announced, I understand, in September. New Zealand's Privacy Act applies to the collection of personal information by both public and private sectors. And as we know, comprehensive national privacy law is really not the only model for privacy protection. Sectoral legislation, which specifically addresses a particular sector or problem, and self-regulation, in which industry groups establish best practice regulations and self-enforced compliance, are two other principal approaches. Now, in this next slide, inspired, I might say, by Commissioner Schroff and created by NIMITY, this slide sets forth all of the sectoral and omnibus privacy and data protection laws around the world. And though not illustrated on the map, New Zealand employs all three approaches, while the United States relies on sectoral legislation and self-regulation for now, although the U.S. Federal Trade Commission and the President of the United States are pushing Congress to enact baseline privacy regulations, which I'll talk about in a moment. And as we are seeing, new uses of technologies can challenge these approaches. Whether technologies fall within the scope of comprehensive laws, which tend to be broad and general, is often questioned. And while sectoral laws can specifically target a problematic practice, if the practice or technology changes, then the statute may no longer apply. Now, a recent UMR study that was done here in this country stated that New Zealanders are increasingly online, but they're also worried about their ability to control their digital presence. Now, this is likely one reason that New Zealand will overhaul its nearly 20-year-old privacy statute following a review by the country's Law Commission. But New Zealand Justice Minister, the Honourable Judith Collins, said, and I'm quoting her, that huge changes to technology and information flows have occurred during that 20-year time, and these changes have overtaken our privacy laws. So let's take a look at some of these changes and their global effects. Technology companies, social networks, and data brokers collect enormous amounts of highly sensitive consumer information and distribute it more widely than traditional data gathering companies ever could. And we, the global consumer, well, we really don't know how much information is truly being collected about us, how it is being used, and whether it could fall into the wrong hands. Now, privacy advocates worry that the very existence of these massive repositories of personal data demand extraordinary protections and controls. These data repositories potentially contain biometric and health data, information on consumers' buying habits, geospatial and location information, social media, internet usage, and much more. And we are fully entrenched in the age of big data. Now, a consensus definition of the term at present is still under development. However, big data is a general term used to describe voluminous amounts of unstructured data that a company creates. And I realize that the sophistication level of this audience is very high, so those of you, especially the winner of that little contest, you'll bear with me, if I go back to the 101 level. But it is also about technologies and the practice of handling data sets so large that national database management systems cannot handle them efficiently. Now, although big data doesn't refer to any specific quantity, the term is often used when describing petabytes and exabytes of data. So sources for big data include financial markets, analytics, sensors and manufacturing or logistics environments, cell towers or traffic cameras in major metropolitan cities, web server log data, obviously social media data, tweets, statuses, messages, likes, follows, etc., e-commerce, site crawling, and much more. And within this data, however, valuable patterns and information exist which were previously hidden because of the amount of effort required to extract them. But big data processing is becoming possible for even small startups because of the ability to rent server time in the cloud. Now, a more cynical definition of big data is when the size itself becomes part of the problem. U.S. magazine Consumer Reports noted in its June 2012 edition that our electronic trails have been digitized, formatted, standardized, analyzed, and modeled. And we, the global consumer, are up for sale. And why is that? Well, it's because our data is really a form of online currency. It is mined, it's collected, and it's harvested to help advertisers deliver targeted ads that we, consumers, may find useful. Now, as a lawyer, I counsel my clients on best practices and prophylactic measures to keep them off of the global radar screens of regulators and enforcers. As a consumer, these practices affecting our data are very troubling. So, what is being done about this in the United States, and is there a global solution? The U.S. Federal Trade Commission has brought a spate of recent important privacy cases against 4 of the major technology and social media companies. As I mentioned earlier, Twitter, Facebook, Google, and recently MySpace, and others which I'll name briefly. Through these cases, the FTC's resulting complaints and privacy consent orders are developing, as I mentioned earlier, a common law of privacy enforcement, since U.S. courts do not issue consent orders through the traditional adversarial process. The FTC alleged that each of these companies had engaged in deceptive acts or practices with respect to privacy. Now, these 4 cases really can shed some light on best practices that responsible companies should draw from them. So let's start with Twitter, since that was the earliest of the orders issued March of 2011. The FTC reached a settlement with the company over security lapses that enabled hackers to gain administrative control of Twitter. The hackers sent phony tweets, including one that appeared to be from the account of then-President-elect Barack Obama. So now that you have a brief picture of the FTC's claims against Twitter, let me give you a bit more background about this case so that you can understand what the Commission's thinking was in this area and then see how it evolved through some of the other cases. So let's begin with Twitter's privacy policy, which included the statement, "We employ administrative, physical, and electronic measures designed to protect your information from unauthorized access." The Federal Trade Commission alleged that, contrary to the privacy statement, Twitter engaged in a number of practices that failed to provide reasonable and appropriate security. 1, to prevent unauthorized access to non-public information, and 2, the company, the FTC said, failed to honor the privacy choices exercised by its users in designating certain tweets as non-public. According to the FTC's complaint, the password that the company used was a weak, lowercase, letter-only common dictionary word. So the hacker used the administrative access to reset some of those user passwords and then to post them on a website. And there, other hackers used them to send unauthorized tweets from accounts ranging from, again, the president to Fox News. Here, the FTC found that Twitter had represented to the public, expressly or by implication, that it uses reasonable and appropriate security measures to honor the privacy choices exercised by users. The Federal Trade Commission alleged that Twitter's statements were false and misleading in violation of Section 5 of the Act, and then claimed that Twitter's practices constituted deceptive acts under Section 5 as well. Consequently, the FTC's order required Twitter to not misrepresent its security measures and then to maintain a comprehensive information security program for 20 years. That is a very long time in the high-tech sector. And also to obtain biennial assessments of its compliance from a third party for 10 years. Now keep in mind that Twitter has to undergo these third-party audits every 2 years for the next 10 years on its requirements, on its compliance with these requirements. Also, keep in mind that the Twitter consent order is really typical of the FTC consent orders in cases of security breaches. And one can find probably more than 35 consent decrees and orders with similar terms over the past 5 years or so. Now, the second FTC complaint in this series was brought against Google. The FTC charged Google in March of last year, 2011, with deceiving consumers when it launched its first social network service, Buzz, the forerunner to Google+. The Commission alleged that Google took previously private information, that is to say, the frequent contacts of Gmail users, and made that information public in order to generate and populate Google Buzz without users' consent. Now, until the time of the FTC's complaint, Google's privacy policy contained two very important statements. The first statement was that when you sign up for a particular service that requires registration, we ask you to provide personal information. If we use this information in a manner different than the purpose for which it was collected, then we will ask for your consent prior to such use. The FTC found that Google violated its own privacy promises to consumers. Now, this is a very important point to the Commission. If companies make public statements and promises in their privacy policy, failing to follow them can result in consumer deception, may be unfair to consumers, and can land a company in the FTC's crosshairs. Now, the second statement that Google made in its privacy policy was that it adheres to the U.S. Safe Harbor privacy principles of notice, choice, onward transfer, security, etc., and is registered with the U.S. Department of Commerce's Safe Harbor program. I'll go into a little more detail about Europe's privacy requirements a bit later, but for purposes of the FTC complaint, the safe harbor principles that the agency claimed Google violated related to notice and choice. The U.S.-EU safe harbor requires that participants give individuals notice and choices about the uses and disclosure of their information, and individuals must have an opportunity to opt out of whether their personal information is to be disclosed to a third party and or used for a purpose incompatible with the purpose for which it was originally collected. But again, going back to Google's actions described earlier, the FTC found them to be contradicted by the safe harbor requirements. Furthermore, and as an aside, the Buzz order has been in the news lately with Google's actions concerning its recent privacy policy consolidation and, if you recall, Apple's Safari browser. A Stanford researcher discovered that the company had hacked into Apple's Safari browser to circumvent both the users and Apple's privacy protection to enable tracking for Google Plus advertising. Now, this review is pending at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, and just last night, as I was preparing for this conference, the Wall Street Journal had an article that said that Google is very close to settling with the Federal Trade Commission for $22 million, and that would be the largest settlement in the history of the Commission for this type of action. But let's go back for a moment and take a look at the elements of the Buzz order. Now, unlike most of the past security breach orders, this one focuses on privacy rather than on information security. The Google Buzz order bars Google from future privacy misrepresentations. It would require the company to implement a comprehensive privacy program, essentially the same 5 steps described in the Twitter order, but substitute privacy this time instead of information security. And it would require regular, independent privacy audits for the next 20 years, not 10 years like Twitter. So this is, again, an extremely long time in the high-tech sector. The Buzz settlement was the first time an FTC settlement order has required a company to implement a comprehensive privacy program to protect the privacy of consumers' information. In addition, this was the first time that the FTC had alleged violations of the substantive requirements of the U.S. Safe Harbor program. Now, the unique aspect of the Buzz order that grabbed headlines at the time, and then again more recently, relates to the requirement for opt-in consent. So let me show you Section 2 of the order. But keep in mind that the order defines Google to mean Google acting directly or through any corporation, subsidiary, division, website, or other device. Now, while most of you are perusing this, you might be focusing, when you get there, on Section B with its affirmative consent requirement. But the key language actually appears in the opening clause, which concerns sharing with third parties. Current FTC Commissioner Tom Rush, in his concurring statement, highlighted this language in the order, correctly stating that Section 2 of the order prohibits Google without prior express consent, now note this is an opt-in requirement, from engaging in any new or additional sharing of previously collected personal information with any third party that results from any change, addition, or enhancement to any Google product or service. Now, Commissioner Rush publicly puzzled over Google's reason for signing Part 2 of the consent agreement. Commissioner Rush believes that Part 2 of the consent order may be contrary to public interest because, he states, a party, presumably Google, is willing to agree to terms that hurt competitors as much or more than the terms will hurt that party, again, presumably Google. Now, in other words, Commissioner Rush speculates that Google may have agreed to this term in hopes that the FTC will include it in other consent agreements with Google's competitors, resulting in an adverse effect on those competitors. Commissioner Rush is concerned that Part 2, this language, might be used as leverage in dealing with the practices of competitors, and he stated, in short, on the face of it, Part 2 of the consent agreement seems to be contrary to Google's self-interest. Therefore, says Commissioner Rush, I ask myself if Google willingly agreed to it, and if so, why it did so. So I thought about this, and I think I might have the answer to this question for my former colleague. Now, Google has stated publicly and repeatedly that it does not share consumer information with third parties. As we know, Part 2 of the consent, which the precise language I had up on the slide here, the agreement prohibits Google from sharing this information with third parties. And because Google does not believe it shares consumer data with third parties, Part 2 of this language, in my opinion, was very easy for the company to agree to. Arguably, the signing of Part 2 of the Buzz consent by Google does not limit or change any of the company's current data practices with respect to third-party sharing. So Commissioner Rush's concern about the Buzz consent agreement being used as leverage in dealing with the practices of other competitors could be very prescient. Okay, here we go. The FTC recently clarified in its final 2012 privacy report that affiliates are third parties. More specifically, the new privacy report states, and I quote, that affiliates are third parties and a consumer choice mechanism is necessary unless the affiliate relationship is clear to consumers. So this clarification was not part of the Google Buzz consent, which does not recognize Google's affiliates to be third parties. Therefore, it will be instructive to see if and how this discrepancy is reconciled. Nevertheless, because of this discrepancy, future competitors could potentially be shackled with this third-party sharing provision while Google continues to share user data with the 60-plus products, services, search, and analytics affiliates whom the consent order defines as being part of Google and not third parties, and whom Part 2 of the Buzz consent decree prohibitions do not cover. So let me take a moment to place a finer point on this issue and demonstrate how, as Commissioner Schroff talked about in my introduction, how privacy and consumer data can become an antitrust issue when dealing with a dominant firm. Earlier this month, Google submitted proposals to the European Competition Commissioner, Joaquin Almunia, over concerns that it abused its dominant position in search. In May, the EU competition chief outlined 4 areas where he believed Google might be abusing its dominant position. These areas involved the way Google ranks its competitors' services in search results, the copying of content from other sites, exclusive advertising agreements, and then restrictions on transferring advertising campaigns to other platforms. The EC will now review these proposals and decide whether to settle the case or to send formal charges. Also, Google is under investigation in other countries, including the United States, by the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys general for potential antitrust violations. But in my view, the precursor to these investigations began when the US FTC approved the Google DoubleClick merger back in December of 2007. And I was a sitting commissioner at the time, and I wrote a dissenting statement that, among other things, highlighted the nexus between privacy and competition. My colleagues at the time, there we go, they disagreed with my premise, but subsequent changes in the marketplace have reinforced the validity of my concerns, as well as my thesis that privacy protection is increasingly viewed as a non-price dimension of competition law. In 2007, one of my key concerns in the DoubleClick merger was that the network effects generated by combining 2 firms might have long-term negative consequences for consumers. In response to questions raised during the concurrent US and EU review of the proposed Google DoubleClick merger, Google assured regulators that the deal was not motivated by a desire to enter the behavioral advertising market. Now, it is true, business incentives do change, and we do know that the company currently is engaged in interest-based or behavioral advertising. More than 96% of Google's total 2011 revenues were comprised of search advertising, and I think that's about 27.5 billion euros. And in the emerging mobile search advertising market, Google has a market share of more than 95%. But returning to my earlier point, Google has often stated that it does not share data with third parties. However, because of its strategic acquisitions in what I will call the back-end ecosystem of the Internet, which I'll talk about a little later in my remarks, Google doesn't really need to share consumer information with third parties in order to enable advertisers and publishers to conduct advertising tailored to individual users. Google has acquired not only YouTube and Motorola, but companies like DoubleClick and AdMob that use consumer information to sell advertising. And thanks to these acquisitions, an advertiser need never leave the Google universe in order to purchase or sell targeted advertising. As we know, the company collects user information and then sells ad space to companies that want to reach consumers, placing ads for advertisers and publishers based on users' preferences and demographic characteristics. And advertisers and publishers, who are Google's true customers, pay a fee for this service. And as a result, Google is selling access to user eyeballs by charging a fee for placing ads based on the massive digital data troves of each and every Google user. And remember, the company's recent March 1st privacy policy changes that are currently under review by the CNIL state that many of its services will be conditioned upon a user providing their personal information. So this collection of user data across Google's myriad of free products and services like Gmail and Google+, in my opinion, gives the company a competitive advantage. And Google has amassed so much consumer data and has obtained such control over so many aspects of the Internet ecosystem, it has created, again, in my opinion, entry barriers that prevent effective competition. Now, I am aware that New Zealand's antitrust regulator, the New Zealand Commerce Commission, has announced an investigation into Sky Television's pay TV business to determine if the company denies rivals access to quality television content in violation of Sections 27 and 36 of the New Zealand Commerce Act. This investigation clearly demonstrates that New Zealand's antitrust enforcers are also concerned about entry barriers that prevent effective competition and have noted the potential difficulties that any entrant would face in entering the pay TV market. As for Google, by combining its various sources of consumer data into massive digital dossiers per consumer, Google can offer to place more effective ads, and any potential competitor would really need a similar trove of data and would need to enter the internet advertising ecosystem in multiple markets in order to compete effectively. So by consolidating its privacy policies, Google can aggregate consumer data across more than 60 of its products and services, thereby increasing the value of the consumer data troves to advertisers. And while we are on the subject of disclosure of user information to advertisers, let us move on to the third entry in the FTC's recent trifecta plus one of privacy-related complaints against online giants, this time against the social networking company Facebook. In November of last year, Facebook agreed to settle FTC charges that it deceived customers by telling them that they could keep their information on Facebook private, but then repeatedly allowing it to be shared and made public. So according to the FTC's complaint, Facebook allegedly violated Section 5 of the Act by falsely stating that it did not share information about its users with advertisers, by not disclosing that a user's privacy choices were ineffective against a friend's platform applications, by retroactively applying its new privacy policy to previously collected user information without informed consent, and then by falsely claiming that it adhered to the U.S. Safe Harbor privacy principles. The consent order was very similar to the one the FTC entered into with Google. So where did Facebook go wrong? Well, the Commission alleged a number of violations, and in the end, Facebook's conduct could be summed up as this: the company's practices did not align with its stated privacy policies. Now, there is one aspect of the complaint that I'd like to highlight, which relates to disclosure of user information to advertisers. Facebook had made a number of public statements that it did not share user information with advertisers without users' consent. Although the privacy policy stated that Facebook did allow advertisers to choose the characteristics of users who could see their advertisements, and that when you click on or otherwise interact with an advertisement, there is a possibility that the advertiser might place a cookie in your browser and note that it meets the criteria that they selected. So this next slide outlines a partial list of criteria that Facebook allowed advertisers to use to target ads. So as you take a look at those criteria, you'll see that an advertiser could select which categories it wished to target, and Facebook would use the member-supplied data to show ads on Facebook to the members that met those criteria. According to the FTC's complaint, Facebook's system also shared the user's unique user ID with the advertiser if the user clicked on the ad. That user ID enabled advertisers to obtain detailed information about the user. The complaint also states that an advertiser could use that user ID to access the profile page to obtain the user's real name. And then, taking the real name, the advertiser could combine that with any targeted traits used for the ad that the user clicked. And then also the advertiser over time could combine all of that information with targeting traits relating to additional ads or other information about the user's browsing activities across the web. So as a result, the FTC alleged that Facebook's statement that it did not provide advertisers with information about its users, it found that to be a false or misleading representation in violation of Section 5 of the FTC Act. And then let me move on to the final case in the FTC Trifecta Plus One, which involves its recent settlement with Facebook, MySpace. So it alleged that the company misrepresented its protection of personal information of millions of users by sharing this information with third-party advertisers. And you'll note that tracking cookies played a prominent role in the settlement. MySpace used cookies to customize content in advertising, and it specifically told users that the information used for this feature does not provide your personally identifiable information or identify you as an individual to third parties. MySpace also assigned a unique identifier called a friend ID to each profile that it created, and the company's default settings made users' full names publicly available through the friend ID. Now, the Commission found that MySpace shared the friend ID of the viewing users with third-party advertisers, and this allowed the advertisers to tie or to sync a user's friend ID and the personal information associated with it with the advertising tracking cookie to compile a history of websites that the person had visited. The information MySpace shared with third-party advertisers gave the advertisers access to users' full names in violation of the company's privacy promises. So under the proposed consent, MySpace would now be prohibited from any future misrepresentations and must implement a comprehensive privacy program with an independent assessment for the next 20 years. So the common themes in all of these cases is that companies should review their privacy policies and make sure that what is promised, either expressly or by implication, comports with a company's everyday practices. Now, another commonality of all four cases is that each of these technology giants is under an FTC order, which means that compliance is legally enforceable, which will help protect the privacy of more than 1 billion users around the world. Also, the evolution of these cases points to a shift in the FTC's approach to protecting online privacy by focusing on information that can reasonably be connected to a device or a person. The FTC's recent privacy report and the cases, in my view, are starting to move away from the previous rules and regulations that were focused solely on securing PII, such as names and addresses and social security numbers. But staying with the disclosure of user information to advertisers, let's move on to a popular way that advertisers and publishers employ to learn about users, and that is cookies. And I know that you're very sophisticated in this audience, so I'm not going to go through all of the ways that cookies can be used because you really do know them. But I will say that on May 2nd of this year, the Honorable Judith Collins pointed out that new communication technologies mean that we are seeing the introduction of third parties mediating the message between communicator and receiver. And the platforms for communications by these third parties, says the minister, are often available for free. However, the real cost of these platforms is individual privacy. Most users are aware that many free websites earn revenue from the advertisements placed on their pages, but many users find it creepy to be tracked across websites. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission included a do not track proposal in its final March 2012 report titled Protecting Consumer Privacy in an Era of Rapid Change. The Commission report recommended simplified choice for businesses and consumers where companies give consumers the option to decide what information is collected about them. And this option, the FTC says, should include a do not track mechanism which would allow an easy way for consumers to control the tracking of their internet activities. This provision, this do not track provision, was also contained in an earlier version of the report, and very soon after its release, industry took the hint immediately. Apple, Microsoft, Mozilla, then Twitter, and now others either now have or are testing do not track features. Earlier this year, Google agreed to adopt a do not track feature for its Chrome web browser, and others are following suit as well. The FTC's privacy report also called on companies handling consumer data to implement additional recommendations for protecting privacy, such as privacy by design, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But quickly, it's a concept recommending that companies build in consumers' privacy protections at every stage in developing their products. Another report feature called for greater transparency, meaning companies should disclose details about their collection and use of consumers' information and provide consumers with access to the data that is collected about them. Then in February of this year, the White House released its privacy white paper outlining the Obama administration's proposal for a new American privacy framework. It included a Consumer Bill of Rights detailing a set of principles about how companies should handle users' data. Now, the FTC privacy report and the Obama administration white paper both recommend complementary approaches to privacy with the tiny little differences at the margin, but largely they are complementary. The FTC has acknowledged, though, that it does lack the power to fully enforce these new privacy principles, and that the principles currently serve as a template for best practices. Therefore, each has urged the U.S. Congress to pass legislation to set mandatory privacy standards for all web companies. So the FTC also is working with the Department of Commerce and companies to develop what they call codes of conduct, detailed codes of conduct based on White House principles. The FTC would have the authority to sue companies that promise to abide by these codes but then violate them. And while we are on the subject of greater transparency, privacy, and online data, have you ever considered how much of your data could be in the hands of third parties? When you go on a website, you probably think, or maybe not this audience, because again, this audience is more sophisticated than most, but I think many people think that perhaps it's a simple transaction that involves your computer, the site you're visiting, and perhaps an advertiser or two. Well, thanks to technology advisor Terence Kawaja, I'm going to show you in this next slide that the situation is far more complex. This next slide shows the companies that could have access to your data and illustrates what I have described as the back end of the internet. In fact, a recent Computer World article that was published here in New Zealand just last week highlighted how it is perfectly legal for online data brokers to collect information about you from any number of sources and then aggregate and sell that information. Also, the IAB, or the Interactive Advertising Bureau, according to them, personal information of internet users in 2011 was worth $31 billion, and that was up 22% from the previous year. So this chart could also help explain regulatory interest in this particular subject and the collection of information by data brokers around the globe. And speaking of regulatory interest, there's a case that came out just a few days ago that I didn't have time to put into the slide, but I want to share with you. And that is the FTC case against Spokeo. It brought its first case against a data broker. Spokeo was a data broker. It ultimately settled this case for $800,000. So the commission alleged that Spokeo operated, it was a data broker, but it operated as a de facto consumer reporting agency by selling personal information to employers and job recruiters without taking steps to protect consumers under the U.S. Fair Credit Reporting Act. And then finally, looking back at this slide, I think this chart could also be described as a natural outgrowth of the policy decision to permit the internet to grow with very little regulation, to foster what is now a very important part of our world economy. But I think that the internet would look very different had it been designed using PBD, or privacy by design, one of the main recommendations of the final privacy report. And the main goal of privacy by design is to incentivize companies to embed privacy features from the beginning, starting with the design specifications of new technologies rather than trying to add them in later in response to legislation or perhaps a regulatory mandate. And PBD also places privacy at the forefront of innovation, essentially making new technologies opt in for the use of personal information rather than the American privacy standard of opting out. In other words, privacy by design is a very European approach to privacy. And in my last few minutes, let me talk a little bit about European privacy and the new proposed regulations, but first by way of background. The U.S. patchwork or sectoral approach to privacy results from the foundational emphasis on free speech. That is to say, personal data is fair game unless specifically regulated. In contrast, the European approach, informed by historical experience with regime abuses of the communists, the secret police, and the like, comes from the opposite perspective, and that is to say, personal data is to be protected unless there is a specific exemption. The right to privacy is enshrined in the EU Constitution, and the EU adopts a comprehensive approach to privacy and classifies companies as data controllers or data processors, and then characterizes data by sensitivity. This directive is enforced by member states individually or through the Article 29 Working Party. In January of this year, the European Commission announced a proposal to overhaul its data privacy rules by consolidating member state laws and enacting more rigorous privacy requirements across the European Union. And I think that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the EU because I want to leave some time for questions. So I will say, though, and I'll note that when the New Zealand government announced in March that it would replace the Privacy Act of 1993. It emphasized that the changes would not jeopardize efforts with respect to its European Union adequacy finding. And I find that very interesting, and I agree with that. So clearly, any multinational company that's holding personal data is really facing some very serious risks, regardless of which countries the data is held or it's transferred. However, there is a common tool that privacy enforcers at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the European Union, Canada's Privacy Commissioner, and perhaps with New Zealand's new privacy regulations, all will have in common when dealing with a company that has breached its privacy requirements, and that is the implementation of privacy by design. This concept really has taken off all around the globe. And as we know, the U.S. FTC has recommended that in its privacy report, and you did see features of that in the consent order with Google and Facebook. But in addition to privacy by design, the U.S. and the European Union appear to have coalesced around a baseline of privacy principles. As I mentioned, PBD, but also they provide increased transparency. The common principles are also giving more effective tools to consumers to control their information, also giving consumers access to their data, and ensuring that that data is accurate, and then also securing the consumer data itself, providing parents with controls over the collection of their children's information, and then also creating a climate of accountability. So there is a lot more in common with the two regimes than on first appearance. And as I've illustrated, the public and regulators are very sensitive with respect to data privacy. Legislators and regulators have made an issue, and they've made this a priority, and risks to companies, I would say, are increasing correspondingly. So let me end by talking about one more thing. One potential way to harmonize these differences in approach by regulators around the world is through APEC, and that is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. It is a collective of 21 Pacific Rim countries termed member economies that promote economic cooperation in the region. And in 2004, the APEC member economies endorsed the privacy framework, which provides 9 high-level principles regarding the collection, use, and handling of personally identifiable information. So the APEC approach recognizes that although each country, or member economy as they're called, may enact its own privacy requirements, commerce typically is international, if not global, and the APEC approach respects individual privacy requirements, but it permits businesses to continue to operate efficiently. New Zealand, one of APEC's member economies, has been a very active member of APEC since its inception. And New Zealand has helped develop and recently endorsed the APEC Cross-Border Privacy Enforcement Agreement, known as the CPEA, which facilitates cooperation between privacy enforcement authorities in APEC and their non-APEC counterparts. And also, the APEC framework embraces the privacy by design concept and will potentially provide a model of international harmonization. So let me close by providing a few practical actions that multinational companies could take with respect to privacy. My first recommendation is that businesses should really consider becoming involved in APEC. A number of multinational corporations are already involved and participating and have great things to add and to share. My remaining recommendations are taken from the FTC's privacy report itself, which would be, of course, implementation of privacy by design. Build in substantive protections into your practices, your privacy practices from the beginning rather than adding them on to the end. And then protecting consumer data. As illustrated in the Twitter consent, companies should maintain comprehensive data management procedures and then offer consumers a choice at a time and in a context in which the consumer is making a decision about his or her data, and obtain opt-in consent for materially different uses, and then, of course, be transparent about your data practices. Finally, as the Twitter, Google, Facebook, and MySpace orders demonstrate, make sure that your privacy policy reflects your actual practices. Thank you very much, and I've left 15 minutes for questions.
Now, could I just ask our volunteers, please, at the back to grab the roving mics so that we can facilitate the questions, please? That would be great. And we do have time, so either here or if you want to sit next to the mission. So, who would like to kick it off for us? Who's got an opening question? Yes, you just want to bash it out. We haven't got a mic for you just yet. Oh, it's coming. Sorry, it's coming here.
Do you think that corporations might possibly initiate more covert practices to continue doing the things that they're doing, so that they can continue to do them?
I can't speak generally for corporations, but those corporations that, certainly care about the rule of law, care about their corporate image, really want to do the right thing by their consumers, don't want to be on the radar screen of the FTC, the state attorneys general, and data privacy authorities all around the world. I think they really do want to do the right thing, but what they don't want their businesses to be hindered by overly restricted regulations. So it's probably in corporations' best interest to engage with the regulators and enforcers to explain the business model. It's very difficult to enact regulation in a vacuum. You certainly don't want to, damper or tamp down this internet and the global economy. So certainly it is in their interest to work with legislators and regulators. Questions everywhere. I'll let you decide.
Yeah, sure. We've got volunteers with our microphone over here. This gentleman just here in the front. Oh, sorry, you've got a mic ready? Go, sure.
Thank you. My question is, with the Western democracies bringing laws to protect our privacy and that sort of thing, what is to stop the corporations from repositioning themselves and moving into countries that are now well connected on the internet but have much worse data protection laws? So what stops, for example, Google or Facebook, before they became public companies, from simply moving to Mexico or Guatemala or North Korea?
Well, and I will say I ended with APEC. If you know, there are 21 countries or economies in the Asia-Pacific Rim, and they're coming up with a number of privacy protections for transporting data across borders. And so I think that, you know, corporations are not really going to find that safe haven because the data protection authorities and the regulators are really communicating around the globe. I've flown all the way to New Zealand to speak with you about privacy because in my role, my former role as a commissioner, I worked extensively with Commissioner Schroff. So, you know, the regulators are becoming very sophisticated in the data privacy authorities, and they all talk to each other.
If I could just add briefly to that I think that companies will find there is no safe place for this because privacy legislation is just spreading across the world like lightning, and the reason for that perhaps is quite a fundamental one. Countries know that they can't participate in international internet trade, which is trade now, unless they have a decent privacy law. So watch that space.
In the back there? Yep.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about the importance of privacy policies, which are company initiated, and the emphasis that the FTC puts on those. Surely,
could you stand? Oh, there you are. Okay.
Does the FTC have a role, do you think, in ensuring that not only are those comprehensive, but they're simple and easy to understand? You may have seen research recently which suggests that the cost to the economy of actually reading all the privacy policies that we're exposed to is something in the order of $780 billion.
Yes, I think that the Commission is encouraging the policies to, you know, be easy to understand, to be simplified. Part of the old game was have a lawyer write the policy so that nobody, one, would want to read it or could understand it, and all these disclaimers. But I think the trend is really to have policies that are understandable, that are transparent, and that really tell the consumer what is happening to their data. So I think, yes, the FTC is very interested in that trend and is promoting it as they have in their recently issued report.
Robert, here. We can get a mic down to here.
Sorry. You've spoken about corporates, government agencies and governments generally. Any remarks?
Was that a question?
Yeah. The question of privacy regarding government agencies, do they have to conform to the FTC regulations, things like that?
Does the FTC have jurisdiction over government agencies? I would say that if there is a breach and there was a privacy policy and it wasn't followed, I would say yes, the Commission could certainly investigate a government. When I was at the Commission, that hadn't been done, and I can't really say if it has been done yet, but yes, they do have jurisdiction. We have yet to see a case being brought.
Okay, over here.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a very enlightening talk. My question is about privacy as it relates to different jurisdictions. So you were talking about the APEC countries negotiating privacy rules as it impacts on corporates. But if my data is held in another country and I don't have any personal control over that government, what is being negotiated, what's being thought about on a transnational scale about whether, let's say, the US under the Homeland Security Act has access to the data of New Zealand citizens, such as sort of government-to-government level privacy issue?
This is a question that is being discussed as we speak, as I speak here. It invokes cloud computing, where there are jurisdictional issues if your data is sitting in a server in a different country. It also invokes issues of homeland security and what governments can access data in the cloud. You know, these are issues that the different countries certainly have to work out. But I will say that there was a recent study, because I know there's been some criticism of the homeland and the Patriot Act and the extra reach of the United States. However, there was a study that said there are other countries actually that have the same abilities to reach into cloud services in other countries. I would say that the U.S. is probably a little more vocal about its jurisdiction and its intention to exercise that jurisdiction, but it is not the only country that has that ability to reach in and take a look at data for security purposes.
Here, and then we'll come to you at the back there. So,
Hi. If you were giving a school...
Sorry.
Okay, I just might add a word about GPEN, which is under which the FTC has recently invited members of a global privacy enforcement network, of which New Zealand is one and other countries are joining, so that we can now pass a complaint to the FTC on behalf of a New Zealand consumer who's been wronged by, say, Google or Facebook. And the FTC will obviously exercise discretion as to whether it has enough complaints to warrant an investigation. But as you can see, we are increasingly getting together and making sure that, yes, you can't get away with murder internationally.
Okay.
Hi. In terms of the Trifecta Plus One, if you were giving out a school report card right now for those 4 companies, what scores would you give the 4 of them?
What scores would I give them?
Yeah, from A through to F for fail.
That's not very NCEA of you. Come on.
Well, you know, what I would say to them is, you know, bring in the right counsel so that you won't be before the regulators, and this way you wouldn't be, you know, you wouldn't be subject to a 20-year consent decree. To me, no company wants to have a consent order and have a regulator looking over their shoulder for 20 years. And, you know, looking on from the outside, having left the Commission, these were very preventable mistakes that I think, had they been counseled, they could have avoided. But I think that also the Commission, because it's a very small agency, it has about 1,700 employees, and it's the... Is that big? Okay. But, you know, it does a lot with, they say a little, and so by going after some of the large technology companies that are violating their privacy policies in Section 5, it really is sending out a message globally to all of the technology companies that, you know, we're watching. And so I'm sure they're not happy that they didn't, you know, that they didn't pass go on this one, but I wouldn't grade them, but I would try to keep them from failing the test in the first place.
Right in the back there.
The reason for the laughing is because what's considered small in the US is actually quite big over here. So in terms of number of employees, that's why the size is different. Now, my question is probably two-pronged. One is, you talked about how various legal jurisdictions are working with each other. Is there, are they working together on a transparent basis where, you know, people get a say as to what's happening, or is it being done in under non-disclosure agreements like what the TPP is happening at the moment? And the second one is, in terms of legal jurisdictions as well, there will be probably countries that you are working with that, and yet, you know, there might be, within the working group, there will be stronger countries and weaker countries, and what's to stop these bigger countries from imposing their list of requirements onto the smaller countries, where the smaller countries do not actually have that much say as to how they control the privacy of their data. I think the most recent thing, not privacy concern, is how the FBI has imposed on to New Zealand what they want it done on kim.com. Now, in terms of privacy, that can also happen in this case, where they can come to New Zealand and say, you know, here, you guys, you're not following our privacy rules in the US, you know, that's not on. You have to follow our US privacy rules. What's to stop that happening in New Zealand?
Two-pronged. The first piece was about transparency and what might happen behind closed doors. As a former regulator and one who was involved in many investigations, it is agencies' avowed position that they do not share the fruits of the investigation as it is going on. That's the way it is with all enforcers. When they are investigating, they don't share that. In fact, if reporters call and they want them to verify the existence of an investigation, what they'll say is there has been reports that we are investigating. So the transparency question, when it comes to two countries or two regulators working together, potentially under GPEN, investigating a target, they're not going to talk about that. That's just standard operating procedure for regulators. Your second question about how big countries might impose their will on smaller countries when it refers to privacy, I'll just give you an example. When I was a seated commissioner a few years ago, there was a country, a small country, with a big voice in privacy. That was New Zealand. When Commissioner Schroff spoke, everyone listened, and it's true. The EU data protection authorities had the utmost respect for the way that New Zealand viewed privacy law. And as I said in the beginning of my remarks, it's very respected. Even the law that you're now rehauling, you know, you're going to take the law and you're going to totally redo it because you think that, you know, maybe it doesn't have all the tools that it needs. Even your old law is respected. So, as far as smaller countries being pushed around, you know, I think some small countries are very savvy. And so I guess how I would answer that question is, that's one of the beauties of the internet. You know, if you feel that you're not getting a fair shake, take it to the people, and they'll respond. Look at what happened with SOPA and PIPA. So I would say that smaller countries now have much more of a voice and a footprint because of the internet.
Got time for just a couple more. One here, and then Mr. Newman, sir.
It sounds like jurisdictional issues are sort of, as always, a really important question, because the internet doesn't have jurisdiction, but all our countries do have jurisdiction. And the question I was asking is, with the European Union leading the way with privacy by design and perhaps slightly more stringent privacy requirements than the US, does this mean that corporations are going to really have to comply with the more stringent regulation in order to comply, basically? So the more stringent regulation is going to really lead the way?
I would say yes, because commerce is global, and the EU is a bit more strict with the way they view privacy than is the US, and I think it's really pulling the US to be a little more aggressive. But I would say that yes, that corporations are going to have to pay very close attention to Europe, because that is a big part of probably their bottom line where they do business.
Okay, last one over here.
Yeah, are we moving to a point where privacy regulators will be anticipating the problems and setting the framework in advance, or are they always going to be condemned to coming along behind and picking up the pieces?
Well, you know, this is true, but it's said that, you know, our laws are in the 20th century and the internet, you know, is in the 21st, and it seems like the regulators are playing catch-up. So another aspect, speaking from the perspective of the FTC, they're also a competition agency, and they would never want to thwart innovation. So they're always very conscious of that. They're always balancing the privacy protections for consumers versus the ability to allow the internet to grow and thrive, and for, you know, entrepreneurs to innovate. So I don't think that they would come up with a rule, because they would never want to harness the potential that we are still going to be seeing in this medium.
I know you may have a lot more questions, and I'm sure Pamela might be able to be corralled during morning tea, but I'm afraid that is all that we have time for this session, which makes me to thank you very, very much. And thank you for not doing the sheep joke. In the principle of international reciprocity, I will not do a safe harbour joke in return, but if you weren't otherwise interested in privacy, I think the one statement about reflecting on privacy as now being the non-price dimension of competition law, that's one thing that's bound to get people interested, if nothing else. So thank you very much for a wonderful session, and to Commissioner Schroff.